World War I started in August of 1914. The United States didn't enter it until April of 1918, or 32 months after the war had started. Why? Basically, the United States was an isolationist country. We did not want to become involved in the things that are going on in Europe. Recall that President Washington in his farewell address warned us against getting involved in European affairs, and there's still quite a few people that believe that at that time. As a matter of fact, Woodrow Wilson was running for re-election in 1916 under the slogan, "He kept us out of the war." So for that amount of effort, how did we then get, we stuck outside the war for that long a period of time, how did we get dragged into it? Even though we were neutral, we leaned towards the Allies. We gave them favorable credit, we shipped them supplies, we sold them food, those kinds of things, while we didn't do that much to the Germans. The Germans, meanwhile, were engaged in acts of terrorism in the United States. The major one was a massive explosion on the Black Tom Island in New Jersey in July 30th of 1916. This was a manufacturing plant for gunpowder. The explosion was so rough, was so big, that it registered 5.5 on the Richter scale as an earthquake. Windows dozens of miles away were blown out, and it damaged the Statue of Liberty to the tune of $100,000 that had to be taken to fix it, and it really wasn't as much as a century later that we fixed this statue. So, as I mentioned earlier, the Germans were engaged in submarine warfare. They realized that they had to stop the supplies coming from the United States to the Allies, to Great Britain, or they wouldn't be able to win the war. So they started sinking ships indiscriminately. The biggest ship that was sunk that got the most amount of attention was the Lusitania in 1915. 1,200 passengers, civilian passengers, died in that event, and 128 Americans. So it was a major episode prior to our involvement in the war, and it brought us over towards the Allied side even more because the Germans had opened up on a civilian liner. Although interestingly enough, years later, they had discovered that some of the manifest, the cargo was carrying war supplies. So the Allies were using the ship as a cover, a civilian cover, to bring over weapons and ammunition. But the event that triggered us in our involvement was the Zimmermann telegram. This was a telegram from the German foreign minister to the president of Mexico. And in that memo, in that telegram that was intercepted by the British, it suggested or asked Mexico to come into war against the United States, to keep us occupied, and if they did, and the war was won by the Germans, they would make sure that they got much of the Southwest back after the money the area that we purchased from them or took from them in the Mexican War. It's also interesting is that before the war, we were in Mexico fighting against Zapatilla, the Mexican insurgents, and it included Blackjack Pershing and Patton. There was an interesting story about Patton during that time. He went ahead, and although he was an officer engaged in hand-to-hand combat, shooting a couple of the Zapatistas, and he tied them, the dead bodies, tied them on the hood of his car and drove it back with the guys on the body. So that was Patton. So even though the war went on for 32 months, Americans were not totally out of it. There were quite a few Americans who fought for the Allies, and this is one of the most, I think, one of the more interesting aspects of this war, was how many Americans fought for the Allies before we officially got in. So that's what I want to talk about now. And they fought for the French, Great Britain, Canada, and Poland. France. Americans fought in the French Foreign Legion. One of the most famous was Alan Seeger, whose nephew was Bob Seeger, the folk singer. He was a Harvard graduate and a poet. He wrote a poem called "I Have a Rendezvous with Death." And that became JFK's, John Kennedy's, favorite poem, he said later on. It's interesting about this, it was only 2 weeks after he had published that poem, he was severely and mortally injured in battle, and it is believed that he committed suicide when he realized there wasn't any way out of it. So he has a monument that has been erected to him by the French government as a hero. Another one of the ways that Americans helped the French was something known as the Lafayette Escadrille. If you recall from early American history, the Marquis de Lafayette was a French nobleman who came over to the United States during the Revolutionary War to help us out. And so when Blackjack Pershing and the American expedition later on would come to the Lafayette's grave, they said, "Lafayette, we have returned." So that was what the Escadrille was, a flying organization. So these were American pilots. They were dashing, they were having the big mustaches, and were obviously the same sort of arrogant guys that we know today, cocky pilots. And they had two mascots, two little lion cubs known as Soda and Club, so for Club Soda, hard drinkers. Great Britain, we had quite a few men that fought in the Army of Great Britain, and more than 300 pilots flew in the Royal Air Force during the war. In Canada, this is I think, an unbelievable number. 35,000 Americans fought for the Canadians. They were designated as the American Legion of the Canadian Expeditionary Force, so they kept them in a separate unit that was very active in the war. They fought at the Vimy Ridge, the Battle of Vimy Ridge, which was the signature battle of the Canadians, and so there were quite a few Americans that fought in that battle, the bloodiest battle, and it was a big victory for the Canadians. After the war, because the Canadians were so grateful for the American sacrifice, that they constructed what is known as the Cross of Sacrifice. That gives credit to the Americans who were killed on their behalf, and it's erected in the Arlington Cemetery in Washington. Poland. 23,000 Americans who were recent Polish immigrants or the sons of Polish immigrants fought in World War I. And many of them stayed on to fight in the 1920s. There was a series of wars between the Polish and the Russians. And one man from Milford, John Pattison, who was the son of Governor John Pattison, was a pilot in the Polish army during that wars against Russia in the 1920s. He was a reconnaissance pilot. Now, we were able to identify several Clermont individuals who fought with the Allies before the war. And some of their stories are very interesting. Del Hardy was from Goshen. He was in the Battle of Vimy Ridge. And while he was on R&R visit in Scotland, he met a Scottish girl, and they got married. And most of his story after that we don't know, but he was considered to be a hero in the Canadian Army. Clyde Terwilliger was a Milford High School graduate. He graduated from medical school at the University of Cincinnati and signed up with the British. And during the time as a doctor, he served in the trenches. He was in a hospital ship, and later some of the major hospitals in London during the war. He took a leave of absence and went back to speak at Milford High School to some of the students, and there made eye contact with a young teacher, and they had a very quick and whirlwind romance and wound up getting married as a result of seeing each other across the aisle when he was speaking. And he later served in the U.S. Army in northern Georgia at a hospital there. And one of the last ones we want to talk about is Alice Stewart, who was a Milford High School graduate as well. She became a nurse at Roosevelt Hospital in New York and volunteered to serve in France. So she went early on during the war, served in a small hospital in France that was on the front lines of Verdun, and it was a very bloody war. She saw wounds of almost every kind that you can imagine. And the French awarded her the Croix de Guerre, which is the War Cross. It is a very prestigious thing that she was awarded. The Americans who fought for the Allies swore an allegiance to that country, and as a result of that, it was believed that they lost their citizenship. Now here is, all these men and women that were out over there fighting in the war on behalf of who would become our allies. And they were insisting that they lost their allegiance, their American citizenship. So Congress had to pass a legislation granting them their citizenship if they went into the consulate and just basically swore that they were American citizens. Another unknown aspect of that war.